Good morning. It is February 22nd, 2026. And we are at Nolin Lake in Edmonson County, Kentucky, which is just north of Mammoth Caves National Park. And it is a cold morning, about 25 degrees out. And there's a little bit of snow falling, but I don't anticipate there'll be too much. At least I hope not. And I think that we'll probably try and keep this walk as short as it has to be, which is not a bad thing. I think sometimes circumstances and the weather can enforce a concision on these conversations that might be ultimately helpful. And so make the best of it. Watch out for Matilda and make sure that she stays active and warm. But I wanted to go back to or revisit a concept that I had introduced last week about epistemic sovereignty. And even more than what I mean by that, I just wanted to talk about how I came to that idea. In the show notes from last week, I included a link to a website that I put together that talks about some of the principles of epistemic sovereignty, but more interestingly to me is how that idea was generated, because it wasn't self-derived. It was actually generated in conversation with ChatGPT when I was driving from my home in Munfordville to Bardstown on Valentine's Day to run a quick errand before I headed out to Nashville for the afternoon. And I was driving on the Bluegrass Parkway, which is, like I've said before, just a beautiful highway. And I was thinking about an article that I came across in Facebook about Robert Williams and the Hubble Deep Field, which was a project that Robert had initiated in the mid-90s to take resources from the Hubble telescope and point it to what was then thought to be just an empty black patch of sky. And all of his collaborators discouraged him from using limited resources on the Hubble to spend days just pointing its lenses at what they all believed to be essentially nothing. But Robert persisted and insisted, and the results that came back were revelatory. They showed thousands, tens of thousands of galaxies, and essentially expanded our understanding of both the scale and the age of the universe by billions of years. Because some of those galaxies, the distance that the light would have to travel to reach the Hubble in order to capture those images would have taken 10, 12, maybe 14 billion years. And I remember when those images came out, I was fresh out of high school and still very much fascinated by space and space exploration. And so those images really moved me at the time, and I'd kind of forgotten because, as might happen with others, is when you're a child, your interest and fascination with the world are so expansive, And I really loved space and space exploration so much that I had attended space camp in Huntsville, Alabama. But as I got older and life got more demanding, my aperture and my interests kind of shrunk. And it was nice to be reminded of that project, and that idea was rattling around in my brain last Saturday. And so as I was driving, I was thinking about that a lot. And I was also reminded of a book that I had read several years ago by another scientist named Craig Venter, who had mapped the human genome in collaboration with the US government and the NIH. And the head of that NIH at the time was named Francis Collins. And so it was a public-private partnership to map the human genome. And they'd estimated when they started the project that it might take a decade or more to accomplish. But Venter, being a bit of an iconoclast and very much an independent thinker, had developed a technique and utilized a technique called rapid shotgun gene sequencing, and was convinced that if they utilized that to map the human genome, that they could do it much faster. And so there was a lot of disagreement about that. And Venter, instead of getting frustrated and just staying quiet, decided that he would leave the project and start his own independent private effort to map the human genome. And as a result, Venter was proved right, and he mapped the genome much faster and compressed that timeline from a decade or more to just a few years. And in an effort to save face, the government compromised with Venter and his team, and they made a joint announcement that the human genome had been mapped many years ahead of schedule. But it was really Venter that kind of pushed that effort forward and achieved the results that everybody, including the government, took credit for. And so Venter wrote about that experience and really his whole life in a book called My Genome, My Life. And I was thinking about those two individuals last Saturday and what enabled them to go against common consensus and to insist on a different path. And I've always admired people that had that ability, that had that self-confidence, that had that self-belief, and were willing to take a chance and go against the herd. And it made me think about my favorite commercial, which is the Apple commercial that was done many years ago that encouraged people to think differently. And it had vignettes of Albert Einstein and Martin Luther King and Bob Dylan. And it said something to the effect of, "Here's to the rebels." And I've always admired people that broke from the crowd and were willing to take a chance and be courageous. And I was thinking about, what type of personality, what type of thinking is required in order to do that. And so as I was communicating with ChatGPT, we were bouncing back ideas around epistemology, which, as I've said before, is not just the branch of philosophy concerned with what we know, but how we come to know the things we know. And as ChatGPT was giving me feedback, it linked two words, and it said epistemic sovereignty amongst a whole list of other thoughts and ideas that it was summarizing of our talk. And it was those two words that stuck out to me. And so then we started building on that idea. And in reflection, what I realized is that had I not been there to both collaborate with the technology as a tool, but also to notice and to exercise discernment, those two words, epistemic sovereignty, might have simply fallen flat and gone no further. And so I was both very grateful to have access to a tool like ChatGPT, but also it reminded me of the importance of having a human in the loop, because like any tool, the tool can help you achieve results, but there has to be a human element to register the emotion and the significance of those results. And it's our discernment that gives meaning to any output using any tool. And that's what I've started to build out in terms of ideas for myself. And another question that kind of naturally comes up is, what's the difference between epistemic sovereignty and simply being an independent thinker? And I've been thinking about that a lot over the last few days, and I think one of the differentiations is that, I at times regarded myself as an independent thinker, but I didn't necessarily scrutinize the source of my thinking, the way that I came to think and believe the things that I have, and so I certainly have been led astray. And I also think temperamentally, sometimes people that might regard themselves as independent thinkers might use that as a way of simply being contrarian and being skeptical of everything: institutional knowledge, academic knowledge, and individual influencers or thinkers. And I think there's a subtle difference in that I'm not necessarily an iconoclast. I am grateful for the world that I've inherited from the efforts and the thinking and the courage of others. And so I'm not temperamentally inclined to be skeptical of everything just by default. And so I have this desire to take information from a variety of sources, but scrutinize that information and make a decision for myself about what I think is true. And the other thing that I think that does for me is that it empowers me to be the ultimate authority on my own beliefs and to not outsource those beliefs to the thinking of others or institutions or tools. And one of the things that I think produces a lot of anxiety in me is this notion of an external locus of control, that I'm constantly subject to events and ideas that are outside myself, that aren't self-derived, self-integrated, and therefore in some ways out of my control. And so what I'm trying to do is develop an internal locus of control. And the notion of epistemic sovereignty is, for me, a way to arrive at that in a more generalized and holistic way, a way of organizing my thinking and my relationship to the world so that I remain autonomous and accountable for my own life. And so I hope that that is clear explanation of how I both arrived at that thought and what that thought means to me. And the other thing that was interesting about that Saturday is that I've had periods in my life where, my mood has been less than optimistic, and I experience that in my body probably even more than I do in my mind and my emotions. And one of the ways that I've come to recognize when that mood is taking hold of me is that my field of view, my peripheral field, starts to narrow. And so when that happens to me, when I wake up in the morning and I wake up with a certain feeling and my vision is somewhat obscured, it's an indicator to me that, I need to get up and take action. I need to move my body. I need to exercise. And in doing so, that oftentimes helps. But in contrast, when I was driving that Saturday along the Bluegrass Highway and just admiring the beauty of it all, when I saw those words, epistemic sovereignty, and I started to bat that idea back and forth between myself and ChatGPT, I had a different feeling, a very, very different feeling. My field of view, my perception visually heightened, and it almost felt like I had an infinite depth of field. And if you've ever seen any images or photographs with infinite depth of field, it's like you can focus on all images at all distances across your depth of field. And so to me, that was an indicator that something was lighting up in my mind. And there's this theory from the Kybalion, or an idea from the Kybalion, that as above, so below, as within, so without. And it reminded me both of Robert Williams' efforts to map the night sky and Craig Venter's efforts to map the microorganisms in our oceans. And what I realize is that there's this strange parallel between, the greater world and our internal state. And so it was just an interesting observation that maybe there was something more there that I needed to explore. And so in an effort to do that, I'll probably spend the next several days and weeks just thinking through those ideas and trying to expand on them further. And for now, the weather is turning a bit colder, the wind is picking up, and I think the dogs have enjoyed themselves enough. So we're going to head back to the car, try and warm up and get some breakfast, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your weekend. And I'll look forward to talking to you next week. Thank you.